All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here, A Time of Victory and Violence. So our objectives and standards: to explain laws that were passed to protect the civil rights of African Americans, and to understand violence that took place against the civil rights movement. And take a moment there to look over the standards, please. And our desired result: what victories and violence did African Americans face in the 1960s? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President John F. Kennedy proposed a law that outlawed discrimination against any individual based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. He also worked to promote civil rights for African Americans and worked with civil rights leaders. Fortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and following his death, President Lyndon B. Johnson continued to work for civil rights, and eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we just talked about in the beginning of this slide, was passed. And here we have President Kennedy here on the left-hand side, so I'm circling that, and it's kind of dark with the black ink there. I'm sorry, the right-hand side, and the left-hand side we have President Johnson. Okay, so a fight for voting rights continues. Now, despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were few Southern African Americans who could vote because of unfair voting laws or practices. In 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a massive voter registration campaign in Alabama, and John Lewis, the head of the SNCC, here's a picture of him up here in the march to Selma, and also another artist rendering of it there. With Dr. King down here at the bottom, picture of that there. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, they lead, and others, organized a march from Selma, Alabama to the capital of the state, Montgomery, to demand the right to register to vote. Now, during the march, Alabama state troopers attacked the civil rights demonstrators, and graphic images were actually seen on televisions around the country and caused more protesters to join the movement. Now, eventually, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which outlawed literacy tests and other measures used to prevent African Americans from voting. It also gave the federal government, the federal government had the power to oversee elections and guarantee fairness as well. So civil rights moves north. Civil rights moves north. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 advanced benefits for African Americans, the law also angered many others and increased racism. Now, there was an increase in racial tension in northern areas in the United States. De facto discrimination, or discrimination not based on laws, but by practices, was prevailing in the North. For example, it wasn't, legalized to segregate African Americans from whites or others, but people treated them differently, or wouldn't hire them, or wouldn't sell them better homes. So again, it wasn't a law, but people treated them differently. That was de facto discrimination. In an example, the Chicago Freedom Movement suggested that real estate agents were conspiring to prevent African Americans from purchasing good homes. So members of the movement began to picket the offices of racist realtors. Marches were also organized for fair housing. And in 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Minister Ralph Abernathy, I believe I'm saying his name correctly, moved to a poor Chicago neighborhood to see what life was like for African Americans. And they focused on ending discrimination in housing and rebuilding poor neighborhoods. Now, while changes were promised by City Council, no real change ever came. Instead, Operation Breadbasket was established by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Abernathy to help improve the lives of African Americans, and Jesse Jackson, whose picture you see there, a young preacher, ran the Chicago office. So, increased involvement. In the summer of 1964, civil rights activists and volunteers attempted to register African Americans to vote in the South. We've talked about this before. It was known as the Freedom Summer. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer, her picture right there, inspired activists by singing Christian hymns, and also fought for African American representation in Mississippi's Democratic Party. She helped form the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, and she was forbidden by her own party to become involved and run for Congress. She did run for Congress, and her actions inspired others to take action in Mississippi as well. So violence grows. In some cases, those upset with civil rights activists turn towards violence. During the Freedom Summer, 37 churches were burned in Mississippi, and the police arrested around 1,000 demonstrators. Now, James Earl Chaney, an African-American activist, and two white civil rights activists, Andrew Goodman and Michael Henry Schwerner, I believe I'm saying their names correctly, were killed near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Now, despite increased violence, civil rights activists did not move out of Mississippi, and more activists came to Mississippi as a response. Now, eventually, actions during the Freedom Summer helped lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, eventually, actions during the Freedom Summer helped lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here's a picture of those three gentlemen who were killed. James E. Chaney on the top, Andrew Goodman in the middle, and then Michael Henry Schwerner at the bottom there. So the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. While violence increased, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also received death threats. However, he continued to work for civil rights and equality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for an end to the Vietnam War and organized anti-war marches. And he was in Memphis, Tennessee. On April 4th, 1968, to support a strike by sanitation workers when he was shot and killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. When news spread of the assassination, there were riots in over 100 cities, and James Earl Ray was arrested and confessed to the killing. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, but later recanted or took back his statement and stated he was set up. Despite arguments and protests for an investigation, Ray stayed in prison and died in 1998. So here's a picture of the Lorraine Motel recently. You can kind of see the wreath there hanging where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed, and they kind of make it look, I guess, like 1968 still. And then on the right-hand side, you have the picture or the poster from the FBI looking for James Earl Ray. So left-hand side, Lorraine Motel, and then right-hand side is the picture of James Earl Ray, his wanted picture, or poster, I should say. Alright, so closure. What victories and violence did African Americans face in the 1960s? Think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and some other organizations, organization by civil rights leaders and activists and protest. Then what violence did they face? Think about the three men who were killed during the Freedom Summer and the assassination of Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. That'll help you answer your question. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and try your best on the questions that follow, and I hope to see you all and talk to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.